Well, welcome. Good to see you out on this December evening. I'm glad that you're here and you haven't succumbed to colds or flu, as so many people have at the moment. Before we start, a few notices. Firstly, a notice about our next meeting, which will be on the 15th of January, here, of course. And Brendan Cahill will be speaking about the Glandor submarine in 60. A very interesting incident that happened in Glandor. I've mentioned to your previous meeting about something that a project that we're involved in as a society, ICAN, which stands for Irish Community Archive Network. Which is a country-wide network, different groups in different counties, being able to upload information onto a central thing. I don't have the technical words, but it's already, Clodagh has been, and several others, including Julie there, been working at it. And the first, for instance, the first 17 of our journals are uploaded on that. So it'll mean that stuff that we put up will be very easily accessible. So that's a work in progress at the moment. And I actually am able to show you at the end, if you're interested, the link onto it. And Clodagh will be able to tell you more about that. In relation to that, we want to try and develop more ways of sharing information, sharing articles, and so on. And what would be very helpful to us, we're getting through ICAN a new computer for it, which they are paying for, almost all of it. But if anyone had a monitor or a television with all the necessary bits on the side for us to use with that, which you're throwing out because you're getting a new one for Christmas, that would be very useful. It would enable us in situations maybe where we're wanting to give a talk in a different situation to here, be able to use that. So if you have a monitor or television, full television,
is it a smart television?
A smart television, yeah, smart. It has to be smart. Yeah, a smart television. But anyway, Clodagh's here tonight and you can talk to her. Anyway, tonight I'm very pleased to welcome Margaret O Dwyer. Margaret wears many hats. She's an artist. She's an art teacher. She's a historian and an author. And the talk that she's going to give us this evening is based on a book that she had published when 2022, Principal Houses in the Parish of Barryroe. And it's a very interesting and insightful study of a kind of particular strata of people in Irish society in the past, which were known possibly as lesser gentry. They possibly wouldn't like to be known as lesser gentry, but that is where they kind of fitted in. They weren't the big landlords, they weren't the really big houses, but they were lesser gentry. Anyway, Margaret, you're very welcome. We're delighted to have you. And oh, she's got a few of these books with her, if you would like to buy one afterwards. So,
okay,
over to you.
Thank you. Céad míle fáilte romhaibh a fad, agus tá muíoch as an cuireadh teachtail seo anocht chun leabhar an ábhar atá fáilte sa leabhargadh. You're all very welcome, and thank you to Ross Carberry Historical Society and Reverend Chris for the invitation to come here tonight. Now, this presentation is based on a book that I wrote in 2022, and I'm going to mention some of the houses, not all. If I mention them all, we'll be here till next year. So we'll just mention some of the houses to give you a flavour of the book. This is Kincraigie House, and it's one of the more interesting houses in the parish of Barryroe. And the architecture, the occupants, and the stories behind Kincraigie House, for example, gives an interesting window into the social and political history in the 19th and 20th century. You can note here the bay windows, the peak roof, and the chimneys, very tall. This house is in fact now a ruin. And I think it was time that the stories of these big houses, bigger than the normal, was told and published for posterity. Now, before we start, I'll just give you a quick idea about where Ibane and Barryroe is situated. It actually comprises of two peninsulas. You have Ardfield here on the east and Ibane on the west. You have Seven Heads to the east, and it lies between Gallyhead to the west and the old head of Kinsale to the east. Barryroe parish is on the eastern side of the map. So we're dealing with Barryroe. Ardfield is the other half. Haven't gone there. I just stuck with Barryroe because I discovered there were enough houses there for one book. Now, this is a map of the ring forts of the parish of Barryroe. The Old Gaelic lords and the chiefs of the tribes of Cork were the original inhabitants of the parish of Barryroe. And these ancient tribes, they lived in ras and forts, and there's a situation of them in the parish of Barryroe. You had the Mahonys in Abbeymahan, the Hurleys in Dunworley, Cowigs in Ardcoig, Colnans in Ballycolnan, and the Cremeens in Lissycremeen. So the names are still there to this day. The present-day principal houses tend to be located near these old forts. For example, here, there's a map, and it shows here a large ring fort, and it was situated near clearly a very big house. As you can see here in the map, you've got orchards and gardens and quite a substantial building. And this is the house as it is now. It's known as Cuckoo Hill. It was actually Cowig's Hill, which was lost in translation to Cuckoo, which is a shame. Now, Ardcoig House is significant because it was once the property of William Penn, Sir William Penn, a founder of the Quaker movement and the founder of the province of Pennsylvania in North America. He was born in London, and he was the son of an English admiral and a naval commander, who later became a rear admiral of the Cromwellian army. As part of the Cromwellian settlement, he was awarded large estates in County Cork, including Ardcoig. Today, the Griffin family are the residents of Ardcoig, and they farm the area. Now, the Old Gaelic tribes, I mentioned there, we Mahonys, Cowigs, Hurley, Colnan, these were the guys and their names when they lived in the ring forts and the cashels. And the next movement happened with the Anglo-Norman invasion in 1169. And we then had the Hodnets, the Barras, and the Roach arriving. And these ring forts were replaced now with Anglo-Norman stone-built castles, which were defensive. These later became less defensive structures and evolved to fortified houses. The Normans were Catholic, and they intermarried with the old Gaelic clans, and they also introduced a feudal system. After that, the next movement came with the Munster plantation, and that was in 1580, and that really started off the era of the big manor dwelling house. And here we have Buchan and Boyle and Travers arrived over with the Munster plantation, and those names are still around Barryroe. The fence was less important, and houses became more residential in the English manor style. Then we had the Cromwellian invasion in 1649, when land was granted to soldiers as a reward for war service. So that was another change to the system. Now, this is a very old map, the Down Survey map. A lot of you might be familiar with it from your areas. And the first indicator of any principal house in the Down Survey map, it shows a fortified house in Port McSherry. It's up there, and I've just enlarged here so you can see. So the Castle Look is gone now. You have a fortified house with chimneys. So this is a big change. And this was owned by Edmund Hodnett. He was an Anglo-Norman who arrived at the time of the Anglo-Norman invasion in 1169. Hodnett put his name on Port McSherry. The Irish for Hodnett is Vic Shaefrig. He was Geoffrey Hodnett. The Protestant lands here in the middle, the very good land, that was owned by the Barrymores. They were an Anglo-Norman family, but they were loyal to the crown during the Munster plantation. Hodnett and Port McSherry and William Barry of Lislee down here, they both lost their lands to Buchan, Boyle and Travers, who were initial undertakers during the Munster plantation. The period of 1780 to 1815 saw an explosion in the number of country houses built or rebuilt by the landed elite, coinciding with the economic boom of the same period. Now, English tenants known as adventurers travelled from the west of England and South Wales to take up tenancies from the undertakers. And here's a map of Somerset in England, and a lot of our people from England arrived from this area here, from Somerset. They would originally come from William the Conqueror from France, landed in Somerset, and some then moved on to Ireland as they were granted land over time. Now, I must define a principal house here because it's a sort of a name that it could cover a lot. So the elements associated with a principal house are generally walled-in gardens. You have an avenue, an orchard. You could have a gate lodge at the entrance, stables and out offices, and a domain. Or you could have a manor house with tenants belonging to the elite. Or you could have a residence of the gentry. You could have legal, military, administrative officers, or clergymen. Not all houses were planted estates. Some houses were purchased or acquired through marriage. Now, this is an image of Cork McSherry House, which you might be familiar with, Cork McSherry Hotel now, which was valued in the Griffith valuation of 1852 at £30. And this is a thatched cabin, which would be valued at less than £1. So the image here shows the disparity in size between a big house at that time and the labouring class dwelling. Remember, the house in the left was only the summer house of the Earl of Shannon, whose seat was in Castlemartyr. The principal houses in the parish of Barryroe, except perhaps for the Earl of Shannon, relate, as you were saying, to the lower end of the scale of what is commonly called a big house. Griffith's valuation in 1853 recorded Cork McSherry House, the summer house of the Earl of Shannon, valued at £30. And at the time of the survey, the average valuation of small tenant dwellings was less than £1. This is a report from the Commissioners of Poor Laws Ireland in 1836, and it gives a poignant description of the living conditions of the inhabitants of the parishes of Lislee, Abbeymahan, Dunotmore and Kilsalloch, which later all together became the parish of Barryroe. And you can see here the report reads, thatched cabins, generally mud walls, poorly furnished, very few bedsteads, no feather beds or mattresses, rushes or furs in summer and straw in winter on the floor, and the covering was a coarse sheet or their wearing apparel. About 100 families had 2 or more families in the same cabin, and the tithes or the taxes were paid mostly in labour. And also there was rarely even a chimney in the cabin. Smoke came out the door or somewhere else. So things were pretty poor then. Now, this is a grand jury map of 1811, and it shows Barryroe Parish. And this is the period now after the Munster plantation. And if you look at this map carefully, you'll see that all the big houses that arrived, they're all on the coast. And by 1800s, the new planters had established new style manor houses all around the parish. And they actually roughly correspond where the old ring forts were situated. The houses marked on the grand jury map of 1811, they give a reference to the principal house of the parish. Cork McSherry House up here, Seacourt House, which we'll talk about in a minute, is down here. And they're 2 of the more prominent houses, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, I was talking there about Kincraigie early on, and this is Kincraigie now, as it looked in the 1950s. And its last occupant was William Barrett. William Barrett lived there from 1924 to 63. This appears here, a new building next to what appears to be an older building. The older building was known as Woodview House. In 1963, Craigie was sold to a Dutch couple, and a year later it was transferred to a German, and 2 years later it was transferred to a German called Gaunter Kausen, and the house became vacant. And after that, the house went into ruin, and there's still a mystery as to say who owns the house. And the next photograph here now, oh, sorry, I said there about, this is where Bill Barrett lived, but this is a house now where it's in its prime, and you have a glass house and a garden, and everything is kept very well. This is it here in the summer, and it's actually a child playing in the garden, and you see the glass house and the trees have been cut. And it's just a very grand house in its day and compared to what the local tenants were living in. This original house was destroyed by fire in 1892 when William Burton Leslie and Jane Florence McCarthy were in residence. They were both 79 years old at the time, and they survived the fire. William Burton Leslie was the land agent for the Earl of Shannon, and fortunately for him, the rent books and the records from an outbuilding were also rescued during the fire. The rent books were vital. So according to Harry Boyle, the 10th Earl of Shannon, the replacement house was designed by Henry Hill of Cork and could be described as Swiss style with open timber work on the gables, which you can see here quite close. A gate lodge now is the only indicator to a passerby of this once fine house, hidden in the woods behind Cork McSherry. Gardener Joe Harrington's mother, who lived in the lodge with her husband, was given the honour of planting the rhododendron tree, which is still there today. It's absolutely beautiful when it comes out early in the year. Now, the name of the house, Kincraigie, comes from Kincraigie in Scotland and Donegal, and the Leslie family. It was most likely built by John Leslie on the site of Woodview House, the older house, and the first Leslie to come to Ireland from Scotland was Reverend John Leslie. And he was a son of George, who was the 9th Lord in Kincraigie in Scotland. And then Reverend John came to Donegal, and he called his place Kincraigie. There's Reverend John, there's the father George. He had a son, Reverend Matthew, and his son, Charles Leslie, MD, came to practice medicine in Cork. He also had a residence in Corkmac, as we have a record of a daughter baptized in this league. Charles Leslie, MD, he had two sons, and Charles Henry Leslie and John Leslie, and they both became bankers, and they owned Leslie's Bank in Cork. This is their 25 shilling Cork banknote issued on the 1st of October, 1824. The Leslie Bank issued various denomination notes and was one of the most important banks in the south of Ireland. The collapse of this bank in 1826 led to serious economic disruption in Munster, but the Leslies were bailed out by state and the Earl of Shannon. Both brothers went bankrupt again and sold their estates to cover their debts. Banker John Leslie of Corkmac, he married, secondly, Catherine Hyde in 1804. She was the daughter of John Hyde of Castle Hyde, Fermoy, and a sister of Sarah Hyde, wife of Henry Boyle, the 3rd Earl of Shannon. John Leslie was land agent to his sister-in-law's husband, the 3rd Earl of Shannon, who had the summer residence in Cork McSherry. John Leslie and Catherine Hyde are buried in Leslie Cemetery, and an obelisk still stands at the gravesite. So if we go back to the family tree, they had a son, William Burton Leslie, who married widow Jane Florence McCarthy Townsend. Jane Florence McCarthy's first husband was Reverend Horatio Townsend, whose father lived at Cork McSherry, and he published a very important book called A General and Statistical Survey of the County of Cork in 1810. This was a treatise on farm improvements in the county of Cork, where he mentions that he enjoyed many hours of reflection at the Octagon, built at Wood Point by the Earl of Shannon. The Octagon was in good condition with a slate roof in 1852, but the basement was classified as an office. There it is now, ivy-clad. In 1902, the Ordnance Survey classified the Octagon as a ruin, and that's as it looks today. Still quite interesting. There are steps going down to the basement. It's still intact, except for the ivy taking over. Now, while Horatio Townsend understood the reasons why ploughing was not adopted in the parish, which he did try to promote ploughing, it didn't work with the local tenants. In later years, Barryroe were regular winners in the National Ploughing Championships. In close proximity to where Reverend Townsend carried out his experiments in ploughing methods, over 150 years later, in 1928, Larry Sexton and his wife, they bought Sunview. And Larry became manager of the Cork ploughing team, which won the All-Ireland Ploughing Championships in 1951, and he also won it in 1954. So his son, John Sexton, John and Betty, John continued the Prompt Association of Ploughing, which was initiated by his father. This is the former schoolhouse in Cork McSherry, and this was built also by Charles Leslie and was supported by Mr. and Mrs. Leslie, his two sisters. Now, William Burton Leslie, he was succeeded in Kilcreedy by his stepson, Captain Horace Townsend, who after his return from India lived in Kilcreedy till 1904. William Burton Leslie's brother, Reverend John, married the daughter of Jonas Travers of Bucklestown House. We'll be talking about Bucklestown House later. So you'll see from the top, all these houses were connected through marriage. The next occupant of Kilcreedy was Colonel Henry Fane Travers, who was a distant relative of the Leslies. Now we're looking here at the gunpowder mills, and the Leslies were industrious people. John Leslie's older brother, Charles Henry Leslie, teamed up with John Moore Travers from Ballinamona, and they set up the gunpowder mills in Ballincollig. They also founded what later became Beamish and Crawford Brewery. Now back to Scotland again, and the connection between Scotland and Donegal are resumed when new residents appeared in the valuation books in 1924. Christina Matilda Caldwell Dagg was born in Scotland in 1884, and she moved to Ireland before 1901. She was known as Nina. Although she never actually graduated, she was the first female medical student admitted to Queen's College, Galway. In 1911, she was registered as a teacher in Bandon Grammar School, aged 29, teaching English. She was a regular contributor to the Cork Hollybough, and the poem on display was submitted by Nina, she married Barrett, by Nina Barrett of Kincraigie to the Hollybough in 1936. And she's a lovely poem there about shepherds. Very talented lady. Seems to be stuck. No. No. Will we go back a bit now? I think, yeah, go back another bit. Yeah, lovely. You're there. You're a genius.
No, I'm not.
Don't ask me. Thank you, Chris. Christina married William Wagner Barrett from Bogstown, House Strand, and they lived in Kincraigie from 1924. And on the right here, you can see him, Captain Barrett. He read medicine and divinity at Trinity College, Dublin, to train as a clergyman. But when World War I broke out, he joined the Machine Gun Corps, and he became Lieutenant William Barrett, the 12th Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment. He was posted to Mesopotamia, known as Persia at the time, and William was awarded the Military Cross and a Bar during World War I. In peaceful times, we can see he played tennis on a hard court at Kincraigie House. And he remained in Kincraigie until 1960, and he was the last full-time resident in Kincraigie. They didn't have any family, so at this stage, this is when it was sold. So you can see the remains of a double door entrance, a portico, and bay windows at Kincraigie House, and they hide the eventful history of the house and leave a reminder of its formal life. Now we look at Cork-McSherry House, and here's a map of Cork-McSherry here, showing Cork-McSherry House. And up here you have Wood Point, where the Collans live now. That was the farmyard to Cork-McSherry House. Summerhill is where the steward lived there, and there's Kincraigie, where the land agent lived. So they're all quite proximity together there. Now, this is the Boyles' summer residence, and the building is an example of the most popular styles of Irish country houses in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The present structure was built between 1841 and 1851, and it had curved gables. You can see it here, a style used for grand mansions at the time. This building stands in front of an older, long, rectangular building here, and it is likely that the second Earl of Shannon built the older house at the rear of the present structure. So who were the Earls of Shannon? The portraits here of the Earls of Shannon, we have Henry Boyle, the first Earl of Shannon, Richard II, and we've Henry III Earl of Shannon, painted on his grand tour. Henry Boyle, the first Earl of Shannon, he frequently defended Irish interests versus the Crown. He was born in Castlemartyr, and he was the leader of the Munster squadron in Parliament and forced to step down as Speaker of the House, but made a deal that he would be created a peer, and he got the title Earl of Shannon and elevated to the House of Lords. Here, the second Earl of Shannon, this is a painting done by Sir Joshua Reynolds, who's a very well-known artist and art critic in England. And he was the guy who planted the woodlands in Cork-McSherry, and they're still there to this day. The third one is an interesting one here. It's a painting of his son, Henry Boyle, the third Earl of Shannon, and he's on his grand tour. This is the age of the grand tour, and it was an important educational rite of passage. This 17th to 19th century custom of a traditional trip through Europe with Italy as the key destination. It was undertaken by upper-class young European men of sufficient means and rank, and they were usually accompanied by a tutor or a family member. When they came of age, usually at 21 was the time they went on this tour. And this guy here, his daughters were known as the Ladies Boyle, and we'll be talking about them shortly. Now, the second Earl of Shannon is the great-grandson of Richard Boyle, the first Earl of Cork. There's the second Earl of Shannon, right? In 1791, his son, Henry, he married Sarah Hyde, a sister of Catherine Hyde, the wife of John Leslie. So they're all connected. And the Earl and his wife, Sarah, they had 4 sons and 8 daughters. The 6 surviving daughters from this family were known as the Ladies Boyle, and they ranged in age from 25 to 41 years old when their father Henry died in 1842, aged 70. 3 of the Ladies Boyle lived in London, and 3 lived in Cork-McSherry. Jane, Elizabeth, and Charlotte lived in Cork-McSherry in the summer house. I was very lucky to get sketches of the 3 of the Ladies Boyle, and you can see here Elizabeth is possibly on the left, and Lady Jane in the centre. And Lady Elizabeth lived in Cork-McSherry, and she was joined by Lady Jane in later years. And this is the youngest lady, painted much later age, Lady Charlotte Ann Boyle, in her 70s. And she was the youngest of Ladies Boyle, along with her 2 sisters. You can see by the dress and jewellery here, it confirms their exalted social position. By the terms of their father's will, the 6 unmarried daughters of Henry were bequeathed the estate at Cork-McSherry, which was 5,800 acres. And it appears that the sisters held the land as a life interest only, with no powers of bequest, and that the estate passed back to the Shannon estate after their death. So there were also independent means and often had shares and bonds as well as the income from the tenants. And none of the ladies married. Each had their share of the rent from their tenants, and records show they had government stock. So they were very comfortably well off. When Lady Charlotte Boyle, the youngest and last surviving Ladies Boyle, died in 1894, she was predeceased by her brother Richard, the fourth Earl, and his son, the fifth Earl. So the Court-McSherry estate therefore reverted to her grandnephew Richard, the sixth Earl of Shannon. Now, here's the sixth Earl of Shannon and his sister in Court-McSherry, and you can note, even at this stage, how the fashions have changed already. In 1845, during the famine in Ireland, tenants could no longer pay their rent, and the landlord suffered a considerable decrease in income. In 1852, the Earl of Shannon was listed as a petitioner in the Encumbered Estates Court. And in 1897, the sixth Earl, Richard Henry Boyle, he leased Court-McSherry House and lands, 10 acres, to James Brennan of Bandon. The lease was converted to a sale by the 8th Earl and Robert Henry Boyle for £1,250. We're stuck again. I think you'll have to sit there.
I think probably you press the two of them together, and that's made the problem. Do you think so?
I'd be careful, I don't know. How did you do it last time?
That way you're meant to be.
Yeah, that'll do me fine. That'll do me grand.
Do you want me just to do it? And you nudge me.
I can go back one if you want to. Yeah, no, come on. Yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to do it for you? Or
Be careful. This is an image of Court-McSherry House. It's now renamed the Esplanade Hotel and was formerly the summer residence of the Earls of Shannon. Court-McSherry House changed to the Esplanade Hotel when James Brennan took over. The son of the new owner of James Brennan was Joseph Brennan, and he was an Irish economist and a senior Irish civil servant. And his signature appears on all Irish banknotes from 1928 to 1953. So that's interesting. There's Joseph Brennan, quite a famous man from this area. During the War of Independence, Court-McSherry Hotel, like many of the large houses in the district, was partially burnt down in March 1921 by the Irish Republican Army, who heard rumours that the military were going to take it over for accommodation. Afterwards, the house was rebuilt without the pitched roof and continued as a hotel, and a porch was added. It was sold in 1965 to Cork Pools Limited and subsequently sold to Vincent and Mona Gale, an Italian couple, in 1968, and they changed the hotel's iconic name Esplanade to Court-McSherry Hotel. And then in 1973, Dennis and Patricia Adams bought the hotel, and it is still owned by the Adams Hotel in Court-McSherry. So that's a brief history of the hotel in Court-Mac. Now, we already came across John Moore Travers when we were talking about the Leslies and Kincraigie and the Ballincollig gunpowder mills. He lived in Ballinamona House, located on the western side of the village of Court-McSherry. John Moore Travers was born in 1768, and he was in fact the last of the Travers to live in Ballinamona House. The house was grand enough to be named on the Grand Jury map 1811, and the Griffiths valuation indicates no doubt that the house had all the trappings of a gentleman's residence. The courtyard style layout, typical of older houses, complete with avenue, a walled-in garden and orchard. Richard Pocock, he was a famous journeyman. He was born in 1704, and on his travels, he wrote his travel catalogues. He traveled around the world and wrote, they were like tourist brochures now. And he, on his travels around Europe and the UK, he noted its importance in 1738 when he visited Ballinamona. He said, "We returned by the Bay of Timoleague, by Court-McSherry, and estate of the Earl of Shannon, and Balnamona, from whence the Travers are spring. So at this stage, the Travers, this was their place. Balnamona House was surrounded by stone walls, and the original dwelling was a single-storey house, seen here on either side of the classic 1960s style house. It's there. So the new house was actually plumped in the middle of it. And the older dwelling attached is a long single-storey building with very thick walls. Long ago, some of the big houses way back in the 1600s were actually one-storey houses, and often a second story would be added much later. So this was actually started as a single-storey house and very thick walls, low ceilings, and relatively small windows that make up one side of an enclosed courtyard. This is shown in the survey of 1841. There's a very unusual doorway. It's a very unusual circular stone building at the corner of the courtyard. And it's probably dated from the late 1500s, very thick walls, two small windows, and a very heavily built door. The door has a small viewing hatch in it, and its original purpose is open to speculation, though it's hard to avoid a security element in the mix. So that old door is still there from the 1500s. Balnamona House's connections with Edmund Spenser, who was no ordinary guy. He was the famous poet who penned the poem Fairy Queen. A lot of you have heard of the poem Fairy Queen at your English classes, and more importantly, best friends with Lord Grey de Wilton, who was sent over as Lord Lieutenant by Queen Elizabeth I. Lord Grey was also accompanied by John Travers, the first of the Travers to settle in Ireland. In 1586, the poet and author of the Fairy Queen, Edmund Spenser, was granted 3,000 acres of land in County Cork by Lord Grey de Wilton as part of the fortified estate of the Earl of Desmond, granted by Queen Elizabeth I, and he lived in Kilcolman Castle in North Cork. And then Edmund Spenser's sister, Sarah, who came over with him, she married John Travers, who was working for Lord Grey. So when Sarah Spenser married John Travers, they took up residence at Balnamona. So here we have, and their elder son, Robert, married Elizabeth Boyle, a cousin of the Earl of Shannon. So they're all intermarrying all these big houses and families. And the marriage into the Boyle dynasty conferred status, wealth, and a title on Robert Travers. He was knighted by James I in 1625, and he was killed in the Battle of Knocknanuss in 1647. The Travers lived in Balnamona until the last in line died without issue. John Moore Travers moved to Clifton near Blackrock, and he leased Balnamona to Thomas Beecher, who later sold it to James and Ellen Tobin from Craig Glandore, and the Tobins to the farm Balnamona. That might know the Tobin family. The Travers connection with Barryroe continued in Butlerstown when John Moore Travers' cousin Jonas Travers occupied Butlerstown House. They had three big houses in there. They had Butlerstown House, Lissycraveen House, and Timoleague House. And Butlerstown House is a typical gentleman's residence. It's set among trees with a landscape garden and gate lodge at the gated entrance on the road from Lisclevan to Butlerstown. Today, the entrance to the GA grounds in Barryroe. The present entrance was the rear entrance. Now, this is an old map of the house here. This is the old entrance here. And there's a gate lodge across the road. So this is the way it looked long ago. And there's a gap here along the trees. If you look, when you're coming in the entrance, you come along and you see a gap here. The house is here. And it gives you a view here across of the house. And this was a landscaping technique used in many large houses to reveal a glimpse of the house on the visitor's way before obscure it again until their arrival at the front door. And it often gave the servants and the people just that little bit of extra time to get ready for the visitors. So they had a good idea and see them coming. The gardens were well developed by 1841, indicating a well-travelled owner with considerable wealth. The Grand Entrance Avenue and the lodge has disappeared. And now the GA grounds, see that's the GA pitch now, cover a large portion of what was once the front lawn of Butlerstown House. So a lot of people go to Barryroe for a match you'll be actually in the front lawn of Butlerstown House years ago. So the pitch is right down top of it. And the entrance now to Butlerstown House is at the back. While the Travers were mostly involved in the military, Jonas Travers was a merchant and he commissioned the building of Butlerstown House around 1805. Butlerstown House, it's a Georgian country house built when architecture was influenced by continental Europe, when buildings were designed using features of classical Greek and Roman architecture. So the symmetry is very even. It was designed this one by Hutchins, and it's a 3-bay. It's called 3-bay because you have 3 windows at the front. You could have 3 or 4 bays or 5 bays. And the 3 first floor windows across the front of the house. And at the side, there's a 6-bay, 2-story wing. So it is a very substantial house. A round-headed door with a fanlight and supporting columns was a very important architectural feature of the Georgian period. You can see it here. And then there's detail of the plasterwork and the stairwell. The cornicing and the decorative plasterwork here on the right are important features at Butlerstown House, which form an incredible display of master craftsmanship. A tall, semicircular, round-headed stairwell window and was often located at the rear elevation of formally designed houses. And Butlerstown House has an additional detail in the form of 2 semicircular headed alcoves here on the stairs and landing. And the bifurcation of the staircase, where the stairway here splits in 2, is also a feature of the more elaborate houses of the 19th century. And a decorative cornice moulding can be seen. So Butlerstown House had all the qualities of a very, very well-built Georgian house. A gate lodge, that's the one that has now been knocked, but that's the way it looked. And a long curved avenue complete the image of the residence. Mike Bryan was a gardener for Butlerstown House, and he lived in the lodge from 1890. Mike was married to Kate McCarthy Crimmin, a sister of Thade McCarthy Crimmin, who was the coachman at Seacourt. Mike Bryan here is grandfather to Michael and Pat O'Brien of Butlerstown. And this is Michael O'Brien here, our local historian and storyteller. And he's in the photograph here with his father, Tom, at the Gate Lodge in 1954. So it was after 1954 that the lodge was knocked. The Jonas Travers, he married Hannah Baker in 1791 of Butlerstown House. And he had 6 children. He had 3 girls and 3 boys. Mary, one of the girls, married Reverend Madras, who lived at Rock Cottage. And Catherine married Reverend Robert Halbert, and Elizabeth married Reverend John Leslie of Kincraigie. So they all married reverends. And then Jonas inherited Butlerstown House from his father, one of the brothers. And in 1869, the Cork Constitution and the Cork Examiner record that Jonas donated a field and site, including a subscription for the building, to the Catholic Church at Listavan. George inherited Butlerstown House after his brother's death, and the 3 brothers did not marry. George's main interest was in the fishing industry, and he was the last of the Travers to live at Butlerstown. They were distant relatives of Francis Johnson Travers, who was an engineer from England working in Clonakilty, who married Nina Travers, a daughter of Henry Fane Travers of Kincraigie. At the sale of Butlerstown House in 1915, the residence and office was leased by Peter Keohane, JP, Justice of the Peace, Bandon. In 1944, Butlerstown House was transferred to Michael O'Hee, and 10 years later, the house was held in fee by Jeremiah O'Hee. His son, Michael O'Hee, has recollections of living in Butlerstown House in the 1950s and going to school in Bandon, travelling by mail car. The contrasting outcomes of Butlerstown House and Lisicrameen House are perhaps indicative of the fragile nature of family fortunes. The same family owned both houses. Butlerstown House still thrives as a family residence, but of Lisicrameen House, there's no trace can be found. An old boundary wall here is the only physical evidence of building at the site. And this is the house, a very substantial house with 2 entrances, appeared years ago. Now, as we travelled from Butlerson House to Listic Cremeen House, we passed a big house in the townland called Ballinvrokick, and the only house in the parish given a name in the grand jury map of 1811. It's known as Seacourt. Seacourt is one of the biggest houses in the parish of Barryroe, recorded in Griffith's valuation, and it was valued at £21, 5 shillings, with 246 acres. It had 18 tenants and 4 unoccupied dwellings. Seacourt is a 2-storey, 6-bay Georgian house with a fan-lighted doorway beneath a pillared porch, and typical of the neoclassical style and an elegant, aesthetically pleasing and well-proportioned design. If you notice here the diminished size of the top, the sash windows at the top on the upper floor, it's designed to give the illusion of a taller building. The terrace lawns here were installed prior to 1900, and the steps were built after 1900. The ornate urns here were made of cast stone, and they're typical of the Italianate-style garden of the Victorian era. You have a close-up here of one of the urns. They're still there. The gardens of Seacourt, as illustrated in the first Ordnance Survey map, show extensive landscape gardens as early as 1841. Note there were no terraces at this time, but the ornamental lake is there. Also, it had a gate lodge, which is actually marked here, but it's now in ruins. So it is one of the grandest houses at the time, had a gate lodge. We know Seacourt was built in 1786 because this piece of partially scorched timber was found by the current owners during renovations with the inscription Thomas Cull, 1786. The likely builder was John Powell, who married about this time Rachel Seeley of Ballylangley House nearby. So another intermarriage between 2 big houses in the area. The marriage settlement at the time was £1,000, an enormous sum at that time, and indicative of the considerable wealth of respective parties. The Powells were Welsh, and they were wealthy pewterers. There was great money making pewter at that time. They were wealthy pewterers in Cork City, and Robert Powell died young and intestate, so his brother John Powell inherited Seacourt and land at Big Park, Corraheen. John Powell of Seacourt and Rachel Seeley had an only daughter and heiress called Mary Powell. In 1813, Mary Powell married Henry Longfield. He was the 5th son of John Longfield of Waterloo House in Mallow. A lot of you might be familiar with Longfield House in Mallow. These are the Longfields. Their first son, John Powell Longfield, inherited his father's house at Waterloo. The second son, Henry, inherited Seacourt, and he became resident there. In 1857, the second son, Henry, married an only daughter and heiress again, Eliza Augusta Purcell. And this marriage could have provided finance for developing Seacourt. The youngest son, Montyford, born in 1866, inherited Seacourt. And it gets even better. Montyford Longfield married Geraldine Spencer in 1891, and you've guessed it, the only daughter and heiress of Henry J. Edwards Queenstown. So by marrying sole heiresses, they were able to build up their property and keep their wealth together. This is an east side view of Seacourt, 1960, and the doorway on the eastern gable here, it leads to an 8-metre square ballroom. Montyford Longfield made several improvements to Seacourt after his marriage, adding an east wing, and in this ballroom he organised Christmas parties for the children of Butlerstown area until it was called into question by the local curate. This is the ballroom, and this is now set up by a couple who renovated for B&B, but it was actually quite a small ballroom, but again, the ballroom was a status symbol and an ideal place to have country house parties. So this is the ballroom, beautiful light flowing in and everything. Now, big houses were important for providing local employment. And here we mentioned before, Tate McCarthy Crimmon. He was the coachman for the Longfields of Seacourt. And here he is on a Victoria carriage with a collapsible hood outside the entrance door of Seacourt. The dress code for the staff of the big house was often in uniform, and it was far superior to the standard attire worn by many tenants in the locality. One local recalled, the coachman had to be well turned out. He wore a long black coat and high hat, and Longfield would not travel unless the horse was shining. Now, there were changing times. The Longfields of Seacourt were considered good landlords by their tenants and on good terms with the local community. Montfort and Geraldine Longfield must have been aware of local sentiment in the early 1920s, especially after the houses of their cousins in Castlemary was burnt in 1920, near Bandon, and Kilcolman was burnt in 1921. Now, they had no heir apparent, and in the circumstances that prevailed, Seacourt was put up for auction in 1921. The Longfields moved to England and they settled in Trimmer House in Cornwall, where they lived until 1948. This property is now part of Exeter University campus. So they weren't poor when they left. They moved to an even bigger house in England, absolutely beautiful. So if any of you are going to Exeter University, you'll know the history of that. Now, as regards Seacourt, it may have remained unoccupied for some time. The record shows Seacourt was in the possession of Daniel White, when Michael T. Deneen, a farmer from Lepp, purchased the house and office on 101 acres in 1946. Here we see a photograph of Michael T. at the doorway and entrance, and on horseback is his son, Cyril. He looks about 12 there at that stage. After 23 years of farming, Michael T. Deneen's son, Cyril, sold the house and a small area of land to Alexander and Sheila Markert, who came from the UK in 1969. In 1983, David Elder and Monica Boland were the new owners, and they ran a Seacourt as a guest house. So some of you may have been there in the 1980s as a guest house. And 2006, it was purchased by the current owners, Ian and Angela Wallace, who were Irish born. They immigrated from Ireland in the 1980s, and they came back and they returned from America, and they arrived at Seacourt, and they initiated a significant refurbishment and restoration program. Their interest and investment leave no doubt that Seacourt, which has been with us for 230 years, will be part of the Barryroe landscape for some considerable time to come. Now, down the road we have Ballylangley House. It's not far from Seacourt, and it's tucked away in a remote valley overlooking the Seven Heads, a few hundred yards from the sea. Ballylangley House, like its neighbour Mount Barry, it predates the Georgian era of square houses and hip roofs. In fact, the roof angle and pitch suggest a very old building with undertones of a typically fine English rural homestead. It also lacked the landscape gardens of later houses. You can see here, they've no garden, that's to feed the barley. Ballylangley House is a large 5-bay, 2-storey house occupied by John Seeley on lease from Thomas Seeley at the time of Griffith's valuation, 1852. The Seeleys were from Devon and Somerset, and we mentioned Somerset already in the map, and they were merchants and traders in textile, shipping, and brickmaking industries in Bridgewater, Somerset, and they traded with Portugal, Newfoundland, and Ireland. John Seeley settled in Ireland at the beginning of the reign of Charles II, and the family seat is at Richmount in Bandon, which is now Bandon Grammar School. Before plaster rendering, the original finish was ivy-clad stone. The house contained a parlour, a drawing room, 9 bedrooms, 4 used as servants' sleepy apartments, and the yard attached to the house had 2 coach houses, all lofted with stabling for 5 horses. Now, there's an interesting thing about the interior of Ballylangley. The house has features to suggest a very wealthy gentleman's residence. You have, number one, a fan-lighted entrance, but then you have a double-leaf front door, which is unusual, having a double leaf, and then there's another inner fan-lighted door in the main hallway. So you have 2 fan-lighted entrances. So they must have been short of money building it. Now, the politics of the Seeleys of Ballylangley is still evident in the house when I visited during my research. In the drawing room hangs a large print of William Gladstone from the time of John Edward Seeley. It's still intact. As Prime Minister from 1868, Gladstone helped disestablish the Church of Ireland in 1869. so Roman Catholics no longer had to pay tithes to support the established church. He also enacted the Land Act of 1870, and his Land Act of 1881 effectively ended the land war. These early Land Acts provided respite to many indebted landlords, and this is the case of John Edward Seeley, who could sell parts of their estates to avoid bankruptcy and allow tenants to purchase their holdings. The Seeley lands were offered for sale in the Incumbent Estates Court in 1858. John Edward Seeley died in 1887 and willed his estate to his sister, Dorothy Holmes. She found the estate was in debt, so she sold it, 126 acres and 6 solvent tenants. In 1892, Mrs. Mary Cohan was lesser of Ballylangley, and her son Timothy purchased the lease under the Land Acts, and he was succeeded by his son Peter, who's here in the photo, who was married to Maura Holland, and their daughter, Lola Cohan, and her husband, Kevin O'Regan, and family are now the residents and custodians of Ballylangley. I came across an example here of Victorian charity as well, doing the research. Across the road from Ballylangley House, near the entrance to Ballylangley, is an ivy-clad ruin and former home of Joanna Crimmins, who worked in Ballylangley. And a lease was given to Joanna Crimmins, giving her the right to occupy the cottage upon the said lands with a lifetime free of rent in the will of John Edward Seeley. The right or privilege was also given to graze 2 sheep and 2 lambs for a lifetime in the will of John Edward Seeley. Now, not all big houses were elite estate owners. Many smaller houses were leased from larger estates. For example, Silverhill, Ballincorrig, and Lislevan Cottage, and they were all leased from the Earl of Shannon, and Farmley House was leased from the Travers. So if we look at first Silverhill, George Kingston lived in Ballyculnan, Silverhill, around 1790. And the first reference to Silverhill was when his daughter Mary married Henry Alport in 1850, and the Alports, they had a gun shop in Cork City. George was succeeded by his son James, and then by his daughter Dora Caroline. And in 1903, the lease was taken over by Thomas Perrott. Thomas Perrott was the son of William Perrott from Abbeymahan. And William Perrott was known as Bill the Banker. He was a moneylender who lived in Abbeymahan. William Perrott's bank, seen here, was not a very big bank, but may have made a lot of money. Unfortunately, the bank has been demolished, which is a pity. William is reputed and bought farms for all of his sons. Arthur Perrott got Mealan House, where Leslie Harper is now. John William is in Borley, Robert Perrott in Lislevan, William in Argyhan, and Thomas in Silverhill. So he must have made plenty of money from the banking. Now, Thomas Silverhill joined the farm with the Blue Hayes at Lislee Crossroads, and he purchased from George Hayes, who owned Spittle and Castleview Mills. There was a lot of money made from milling before. Not everybody was allowed to have a mill. You had to have a license for it. Thomas had a son, Thomas Hosford Perrott, and he married Edith Carrett. She's pictured here in the garden of Silverhill, and they farmed Silverhill until 1956. Having no immediate male successor, the Land Commission purchased the estate and divided it up. They had 2 daughters who went off and got married, so they divided up the estate in 1956. The house and 4 acres of land was purchased by John O Dwyer, who was a national school teacher from Schull, and his wife, Mary Sheehy, whose mother came from Barryroe. And that's their son there tonight. Brian. Yeah. Now, Robert Perrott was a brother of Thomas William of Silverhill, and he leased the property from the Ladies' Boy. Have I the wrong one? I'm going on to, yeah. I did it wrong again. Okay. He found, having no immediate success, the Land Commission purchased the estate and divided it up. I have that done. Yeah. Oh yeah, Robert Perrott. Yeah. A brother of Thomas, he married Elizabeth Mary Deans, and they had a son, Fred, who married Kathleen Mary Daunt of Derrygraw House, Ballineen. The house is called Cottage in the map because it originated as a single-story building, and it developed into a 2-story building in 1902. So they're now called Lislavan House. It used to be known as Lislavan Cottage. And the Maloney family now reside in Lislavan House. This is Ballincorrig House. The Woodburns lived in Ballincorrig and they were tenants of the Earl of Shannon. Samuel Woodburn, he was a sailmaker and he came from Dublin and he married Susanna Webb, a widow, in 1832. The house is described as a first-class private dwelling and was leased by the Woodburn family from the Earl of Shannon. Matthew Woodburn, photograph here, and his son, Richard, married to Mary Kate Good in 1903. You can see their photograph there. And I was very lucky doing the research because there was letters survived from 2 immigrant sons and an uncle written by family members in Ballincorrig, describe a close-knit family trying to survive the difficult circumstances after losing their father at an early age, their financial struggles and immigration. So there were struggles in all stratas of society. It wasn't just the tenants were struggling, these were struggling as well. And unfortunately, there was no record of corresponding letters back from the Woodburn family because the family members, 2 of them were drowned on board ship when they worked abroad. They're an example, the Woodburns, of one of the 10 farmers who benefited from the Land Acts of the late 19th century, succeeded in buying the lease of the house and farm from the Earl of Shannon under the Irish Land Purchase Act of 1881. In 1868, they had 3 daughters, and their 3rd daughter, who married John Smith, they sold Ballincorrig and moved up to Lewistown, Kildare, with their youngest son, Gerald. After that, John and Helen Holmes were the owners, and in 1973, they sold the property to Dave and Nora Hagerty. The residence has recently refurbished by Dave Hagerty's son, Jim, and his wife, Dolores, and they now do Airbnb there. Farmley House, then, in Lissycrameen, was a more typical Georgian house built by the Herds, where previously there stood 2 very old houses with metre-thick walls. The Herds arrived in Ireland, and they came from Wiltshire in England, and they received a land grant, part of the abandoned settlement of the plantation of Munster, organised by the Earl of Cork. After the Munster plantation, the Travers became the occupiers of Lissycrameen, and it was in their time that Farmley House was built. John and Elizabeth Hurd of Tiblee were leasing Farmley House from Robert Travers in 1852, and their son Thomas took up the lease after that, and his brother Richard followed, and he was married to a widow called Eva Helena Graham. She died before they moved from Doneraile, and they had 1 daughter, Gladys, who is recorded as being present at her father's bedside when he died, and we can't find any trace of what happened to Gladys after that. The O'Driscoll sisters, Kathleen, Mary, and Ellie, were daughters of Edward and Marie O'Driscoll Bandon. They were the next to occupy Farmley House, before it was purchased by Timmy O'Brien, whose son John O'Brien and family now reside in Farmley House. This is Lislee Church. The parish of Barryroe was an amalgamation of the parish of Lislee, Kilslock, and Dunamore, and a small portion of Abbeymahan. The only glebe for these parishes was at Lislee, and it was the principal church. After the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, many old churches became Protestant. 2 surveyors on this beautifully drawn map by John Maloney up here are shown with a surveyor's chain, which measures 22 feet. On the map here can be seen one of the houses beside the church, which may have been the vicarage. The established church was a very wealthy church, and the tithes paid in Barryroe were split between the church and the Earl of Shannon. In 1837, Samuel Lewis describes the rectory as the seat of Reverend J. Stewart. The total rent charge of the parish at that time was £561. £152 was payable to the Earl of Shannon, and the remainder went to the vicar. The church was consecrated and the roof removed in 1961, but the church's steeple was preserved because it was a landmark used by sailors offshore. Lislee House, near the ruins of the church, Lislee Glebe, or Glebe House, and latterly Lislee House, was established by Reverend Edward Singh. It was built in 1810, and the glebe had 42 acres of land attached. Reverend James Stewart was leasing the glebe and 23 acres of land from the ecclesiastical commissioners and the Boyle estate at the time of Griffith's valuation, 1853, and the house was valued at £24 5 shillings. It was a very elaborate building in the 19th century. It's a classical Georgian country house with gardens and a gate lodge at the entrance. A 4-bay, 2-story building of balanced proportions, now used as a private house. Since the construction of the main house in the early 1800s, a few colourful characters have passed through its doors, and you could read about that in the book if you want to hear more about them. Now, at this stage, it's time to talk about the Anglo-Norman Barrys, because the name of the townland is Barryroe. And they were Anglo-Norman, the Barrys, and they owned large tracts of land in County Cork. This is just a very simple genealogy map of the Barrys. The top guy here, William Whale Barry, he came over in 1375, and his son Lawrence was the first Lord Barryroe. The title went down through the generations to 2 brothers. We move it down with 2 brothers. We were red and the blue. And the brothers were David Fitzjames. He was Viscount Buttevant. And on the right, we have William Barry, Lord Barryroe. Both were jailed for their part in the Desmond Rebellion. This is the reaction of the Irish to Queen Elizabeth's plantation. David Fitzjames and William Barry, the brothers, both of them, were later pardoned by Elizabeth. Viscount Buttevant, David Fitzjames, he remained loyal to the crown, and his brother William sided with the Irish. So David Fitzjames' grandson David Fitzdavid became the first Earl Lord Barrymore. Meanwhile, William's grandson, who was also called William, lost his lands to the Barrymores after the 1641 rebellion. So the Barrymores circled in red and the Barryroes in blue. Their castles were in Buttevant, Liscarroll, Barryscourt, all controlled by the Barrymores. Smaller castles were in Rathbarry, Ardfield, Lislee and Timolee governed the barony of Ibane and Barryroe, territory of William, the 6th Barry, known as William Whale. Now, there's a map here now of the 3 Barry houses of interest in the area. We have Mount Barry, Donogmore House, and Barry's Hall. Barry's Hall is actually in Timolee, but we put it in because it's a Barry house. So we have Mount Barry here and Donogmore House. And we just have a quick look at Mount Barry. And you can see it's right beside Ballylangy House we were talking about a while ago. And the stone wall in front here reveals a significant dwelling in some bygone era. James Redmond Barry was born in 1789 in Mount Barry at the Seven Heads. He claimed descent from the original Barryroe through William Barry of Lislee when he claimed heir to the title of Viscount Buttevant, a title that became extinct after the death of the 8th Earl Barrymore. James Redmond Barry was a man renowned for his efforts to promote the well-being of the community. He was the Commissioner of Irish Fisheries, and his principal residence was in Glandore, and he's well respected in the community, and his father lived in Donogmore. If you visit the church in Glandore, there's amazing tribute and posters about him. Now, Donogmore House is similar to Mount Barry. They're like sister houses, just next to each other. Donogmore House was the residence of James Redmond Barry's father. And it's a substantial house, and it guards the entrance into the sea at Barry's Cove, because a lot of the money made in those days was from smuggling. There's Barry's Cove. So house is just here and just down the road there into Barry's Cove. So in those times, there was a lot of smuggling going both by the Irish and the English. Barry's Hall was of interest because of the direct link with Lord Barrymore. David John Barry, he was the 2nd Earl of Barrymore, and he was the recipient of William Lord Barry's confiscated land. So he got William Barry's confiscated land. He died in Barry's Hall in 1744. He left his estate, including lands in Ibane and Fota Island, to his nephew, John. John's son, James Hugh Smith Barry's residence in Ireland was Fota House. There he is. James Hugh Smith Barry, his grandson was also called James. He was the occupier and owner of Barry's Hall in 1852. His son, Arthur Hugh Smith Barry, pictured here, he lived in Fota House and he completed the Arboretum in Fota. The title Earl Barrymore ceased with Arthur Hugh's granduncle, the 8th Earl, who had no issue. The next in line, Arthur's grandfather, was deemed ineligible because his father, James Hugh Smith Barry, he refused to marry Anne Tanner, the mother of his children. Arthur Hugh Smith Barry of Barrymore of Photo House died in 1925 and his estates were disposed of. Barry's Hall was then purchased by the Bateman family, who are still the current owners. Now, this is a painting here, and it's showing the pastimes of the local gentry. In Barry's Hall, it's hanging on the wall there, and it depicts the lifestyle of the gentry during the 1800s, the period we've been talking about. This painting of the big house gives an artist's impression of its at its prime as a centre of hunting, fishing, the pastimes of the local gentry. You have carriages, portico, coats of arms, and Timoleague Abbey is there. And the people of these houses, they often travel long distances, sometimes by train, complete with horse and hounds, to partake in the hunting season. The publication of this book, The Principal Houses, it would not have been possible without the fantastic cooperation of the owners of these houses and their willingness to share information. Although regarded as physical symbols of the colonisation of Ireland, these houses were built by local craftsmen. They remain part of the heritage of the parish of Barryroe. And thanks to the commitment and dedication of the custodians and present owners, these houses will continue to be part of our heritage for time to come. You might think, Reverend Chris Peters, I must thank him for giving me permission. You might remember, you gave me permission to use an old map here of Ballymac, Shonin. And he was a dean of St. Faulkner's Cathedral, Ascarbery at the time, and this is where the map is held, a very ancient map. And it confirmed a local folk story that there was a deer park in Carrigain, because this map actually states that. And Carrigain is near Butlerstown in Barryroe, and there's actually the remains of a deer park, but we never had confirmation until this map showed it. So it's thank you to Reverend Chris Peters for the help in that, and thank you to everybody for coming here tonight.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. Number of things strike me. The amazing research that has gone into it, which is brilliant. And I'm amazed at the number of houses in the parish of Barryroe. It's extraordinary that there were so many houses.
I thought there were 8 when I started, and I landed up with about 20.
This is just amazing to think. And also, I mean, as I said at the beginning, as a kind of insight into a kind of strata of Irish society that possibly doesn't get much mention. The big landlords do, everyone else does, but this particular strata, the middle ones, don't figure very much. So, and what your research has filled a very significant, filled the gap very significantly, and with incredible research. So anyway, any questions from anyone? Can you go, Lily Jo, can you go and get the coffee on the go? Any questions, any comments?
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah.
You mentioned the sexton and their involvement with the ploughing in West Cork, and Cork House of Prattmines, who was a very well known ploughman.
Yeah, I should have mentioned him as well. Yeah, he's probably in the book.
And Brian Burke Norton, the Timoleague people had a monopoly of the ploughing association. They were the bosses of it in those back in the 50s and before that.
Oh, before him.
The other organisations got their foot in and made it more democratic.
Oh, that's interesting.
And the Timoleague people monopolised the scene. And at one stage, their kingpins were Sir Benin, who was under 21, and the senior grade was Jack Deasy. And they had been the bosses of the ploughing thing. And lo and behold, 2 others beat them in the Timoleague ploughing match, John Welch who was the brother to the former parish priest we had here in Ross,
All right.
and Tim Crowley from Rennisgreen won the under 21 section.
Oh,
And the Timlee boys couldn't take their beating, and they issued a challenge to the others to plough them at another stage. But obviously, the winners ignored this challenge. That was only a pair that just couldn't take their beating, and they were beaten by.
that's interesting. I never knew that now. So it was Larry Sexton so started it for Barryroe.
Well,
And Cyril Deneen and
with Larry Sexton,
Larry never
was
ploughed
one
at
of the
Sydney, yeah.
bosses of the
exactly, he
council.
didn't plough, he was in charge, yeah.
And
Yeah.
Cyril Deneen was a very promising
That's right.
21 ploughman, and Jack Deasy was an established senior ploughman.
That's interesting.
And they were beaten by these, and that was back in the 50s.
That's interesting now.
I could just add a point about the ploughing there. One of the reasons that Sexton is in there as a ploughman is that in Kincraigie, Horatio Townsend carried out a whole load of research on agriculture. My background is agriculture. And in the survey, the statistical survey of Cork, published in 1810, he made reference to showing the local tenant farmers how to use a plough, the Scottish plough at that time. And in fairness to him, he said it was difficult, and they really didn't take it up that quickly because largely they couldn't afford the plough. So it tells you how poor the people were. The other thing that came across with the ploughing was that one of the references was that there was no dairying in Barryroe. Literally, the whole place was in tillage, was worked by plough. It was an old system of farming where the sods were turned up by hand in groups, and the sods were burnt, and then redistributed back in the ground again, and that was their eelworm control, their pest control of that. So I found it fascinating that Horatio Townsend, that was a huge document produced in 1810. And I can remember many years ago being at a talk here in Mascalvey about tsunami of 1799, many years I say. The argument about the Mascalvey and Cotton Bays being sanded over by the tsunami. But strangely, Horatio Townsend made no reference to it. It was published in 1810, and the tsunami was in between 1740 and 1790. But he made no reference. He made no reference to changes in cotton cherry at the time. So it would mean that maybe the tsunami didn't do all of this. It was a bit earlier. I found that interesting. And another thing I came across, I did the Silver Hill piece. We came across letters from Silver Hill to from actually you heard Mary Alport, buried in this day. She wrote to her brother George in Australia, and we never knew what happened to George or where he went. But these letters showed it. But one of the letters in that was from Nolan McCarthy to his daughter. And we did hear kind of rumor that the son, George Kingston, had eloped with this Mary McCarthy. But I also heard that he went to Australia and she followed him out afterwards. Now, I think that is likely to be the case because there was a court case pending in Clonakilty the year he left. So, but I'd say no more about that. but the Owen McCarthy mentioned in his letters, this was around 1870-ish, of the conditions, and he said there's not a fish to be found, no potatoes, and only only Indian corn to eat, and that was in 1879. Like that was way after the famine, but it was that things was that bad at that time.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, the other thing I found very interesting, there are an awful lot of names that are still very familiar.
That's why I put them in, because it links,
That's right.
doesn't
That's
it?
right,
Yes,
yeah.
it's amazing. They're still here.
And from my point of view, an awful lot of Churchill Island names. that
You'd
are
know
still-
them still, yeah.
still
You would,
there.
yeah, it's interesting.
Anyway, look again, thank you very much indeed. We do appreciate you coming
Welcome.
and found it fascinating. Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.